Well, hello, and welcome to another podcast today. Amber, how are you feeling this great day?
Yeah, I'm feeling really good, Martin. How about you?
It is a beautiful sunny summer day out there. It is amazing.
Technically, it's not summer yet.
Well, the 34 degrees Celsius is telling me I'm loving it. I'll tell you that.
Well, depending on when this podcast airs, it may actually be officially summer, but it's certainly not necessarily quite there yet.
Yes, yes. And so today I'm going to do something we've never done before.
Oh,
Yeah, so you ready?
yes.
I'm going to revisit a topic we've talked about already because it's timely in
Okay.
how we are talking about it. So for our listeners, you may remember that our very, very first podcast was a DEI conversation.
Mm,
And we recorded that at the end of 2024. And at the end of 2024, we were just beginning to see elements of pushback against DEI. These were the early days. We were cutting edge.
2024.
Yes. And now here we are, summer of 2025. And wow, to say something has been vilified or
Mm,
demonized,
mm.
what a topic for being demonized in a 6-month period. And I could not go another episode without us revisiting that topic.
Great. I think it's a good idea. And I think perhaps our thoughts haven't necessarily changed, but the context has. And that actually brings more advocacy forward in my mind, certainly in my heart, because I have had moments in the last few months where I have just been in great disbelief at what I've heard. And also, I think what I am feeling. Um, and it's not that I have changed my mind at all. It is that it is even more important to speak out and to boldly, with feistiness, state very important beliefs and values that I hold. How do you feel? Do you agree?
I am absolutely, I was in shock when that was the topic we started with. And most recently, I was part of an RFP process for a position.
Okay.
And the one question I got asked the most about was, Martin, how did you come up with your DEI programming? How did you inform that? And where did so on one hand, we've got one element of the world that's telling us absolutely get rid of this program. It is not valid whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I'm looking for some work and it is literally the matrix by which
Yep.
I'm being assessed.
That's because those organizations are actually living in the real world, not in the political rhetoric. Political rhetoric is not the real world. We all know this consciously because as non-political members of society, and by that I don't mean that we're not voters. I just mean we're not necessarily politicians. We're just living our lives, doing what we need to do. Politics has a role to play in our decision making, but it isn't the real world. It isn't. It's theater that unfortunately informs so much of our rulemaking and so much of what we believe is true about what's going on in the culture around us. But in the day-to-day, so very often it is not even connected, right? So like I often use the example of in the micro moments. That's the you and me sitting here talking to one another. It's the me and someone on the street. It's me and a couple of people on a project team, and it's us working together. Those micro moments, diversity, equity, and inclusion is of preeminent importance because it is how we build community and connection. It is how we collaborate. It is how we successfully deliver great work. In the macro, which is this big abstract thing, which is where politics and news media and theater of the world lives, it's a polarizing conversation. And in the macro, it is utterly preposterous to ditch it, but people are trying to do it all the time. And it's the micro moments where I think I just prove to myself time and time again, that's what really makes a difference. But we have to live in the micro, and a lot of us want to think in the macro. And organizational strategy, of course, is a lot of macro. But really conscious organizations right now, their macro strategic planning includes it because they recognize, man, our teams don't work if we, segregate, if we, our HR manuals, the manuals that are so thick, hundreds and hundreds of pages, those HR books from the insurance company are in place because you can't you can't function without them. But in practice, throwing them out means you can't even insure yourself, which is just not feasible for organizations, which is why in the micro, those macro strategic ideas, they don't play out. They just don't. And as much as I have issues with insurance, just because I think insurance often functions as a bit of a racket. So if you work for an insurance company, I'm sure you feel sometimes that some of the qualifiers and the decisions made and the financial kind of gains in insurance don't always pay off. And it isn't always in light of the best interests of the organization who has to pay the insurance premium. However, we have to have it. And in order to have it, we have to have these policies in place. And that's why the micro and the macro don't communicate well with one another. What's the balance, right?
Absolutely. And I'm glad you're going with macro and micro, because the first question I really want to hit with is, here in Canada,
Mm-hmm.
we have several action plans at a macro
Yeah,
political federal government level.
correct.
And I'd like to ask some individual questions about each one of these.
Sure.
The first one, and I'm making it first because I know it's near and dear, is the 2S LGBTQIA plus
Mm-hmm.
program that was established as an action plan from the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
This is our federal government's action plan.
Mm-hmm.
And it must be part of some of the macro pieces.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm literally bringing this one to you because I know how close it is to you, and giving you a space now to just put whatever you'd like to into this conversation.
So I was listening to a report just in the last week about an event that was hosted. I believe it was in the United States somewhere, and it was a queer event. And the MC who was chosen to lead the event said this as he was, or they, to be honest with you, I don't know what their gender was, so I'll use they, them. They welcomed everyone to the event, and they said this: "Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and those of us who know better." And then they went on with their, and it really resonated with me as a parent of two queer non-binary children, because I recognize that I am now not a lady or a gentleman. I don't identify as either of those. I identify as the third category, which is those of us who know better. Now, that doesn't disqualify male and female as gender. It doesn't. It just simply says those of us who know better know we don't have to gender a welcome to make people feel welcome. Now, obviously, I think the person leading that MC conversation was doing it a bit tongue in cheek. And I support that. And I understand, probably from an advocacy standpoint, it was important for them to make that impression. But for me, I went, whoa, me, Amber, 2025, I am people that know better. That's my category. That doesn't mean I'm not female, because I identify as female. I was born female and I identify as female. But I was aware that that's how much opportunity there is for us to have a greater conversation about, micro or macro, whether the government of Canada says this is what's good and right and needs to happen or not. Those of us who are on a journey, who have learned more, and because of that learning, we make different and perhaps better, or I would say wiser, judgment calls about gender. We don't have to be attached to the binary. I don't feel threatened at all by the binary or the need to attach to it. And I am aware that for someone of my age, it's a bit unusual perhaps, but I'm grateful to be in that category. And I think, let's face it, the government of Canada has, for whatever reason, the government of Canada has recognized through the leadership of politicians, and I would say strong advocacy. They have recognized that valuing diversity, including everyone at the table, and looking for ways to create equitable spaces, regardless of how you identify, who you are, and what your beliefs and values and your sort of life choices are. That's pretty cool. And it doesn't exist everywhere in the world. Up until pretty recently, I was under the impression that it existed to my neighbor to the south. Much to my dismay, I recognize, oh no, that actually hasn't been true. Or it hasn't been fully true. So I think, within Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms, within Canada's Truth and Reconciliation statements, with all of our work in understanding who we are as a country and who we are as a country that welcomes immigrants, that always has done that, and at the same time is coming to terms with the fact that our territories are unceded, that we have a long history of colonialism. We are still a constitutional monarchy in Canada, which means we have a king, folks. We have a king. Now, the king, just as we know, just can talk on our behalf and maybe doesn't make ruling decisions. As recently as not long ago, the king came and actually gave a speech from the throne as a courtesy to our country and to our politicians. But the point here is we have a lot of work to do to unpack the atrocities that we ourselves as Canadians are guilty of. And it is in this space of diversity, equity, inclusion that we have so much to learn from. So I'm grateful to live in this country. Not that we get it right, that we are engaging it. And there's just so much work here to be done. I had an interesting conversation. I was recently at I was actually a project management event, a professional development day. And I've had the honor and privilege to work with local Indigenous tribes in training and in really, I would say, wisdom growing on my end, in that I have just sat under their wise ways and been taught and led. And I was speaking with this gentleman who is also a project manager, and he's working with some really cool projects in BC with Indigenous tribes. And we brought up DEI, and he stopped me. And he said, I'm going to push back on that. Those words are in the wrong order for the work that I do. And I was like, talk to me about that. Because I was like, love that. Love a reframe, right? And he said, you know what the most important word to go first is? And I was like, no, I don't in your context. He said, it's inclusion. And I said, talk to me about what that is for you. And he said, if we are not pushing for inclusion first, the other two can't follow. And he said, and he said, as in himself, identify as inclusion is the first work. It is creating inclusion. And he said, we do inclusion first. And then in the midst of doing that inclusion, the inclusion creates the conversation, the collaboration that then very specifically talks about, well, what then is diversity and equity going to be, because we are inclusive. And I was like, wow, never thought of it that way. So I really gained a lot of wisdom just by his example. And he said the reason that is the case for him is because it is so important that inclusion happen, or else the wrong voices are beginning to make decisions about diversity and equity. And he said those voices come with privilege, expectation, arrogance, bias. And he said, so the inclusive has to be first, or else you can't even begin to have a conversation that is ending up creating diversity and equity that's relevant to everyone at the table. If inclusive is the last one, it's too late. Phew. Mind-blowing. Loved it. And so I would say, when you talk about this LGBTQIA plus from Government of Canada, I would just say that's what I love. Even the fact that Canada is willing to recognize Two-Spirit and understand it and begin to embrace Indigenous approach to what is gender and how do they see and hold it and view it, and what is the historical kind of understanding from their cultures. This means they're going to the inclusive first. We're creating inclusive conversations. And then because of that, everyone is having an opportunity to tell us what's what from their perspective.
I absolutely love that. And in that same conversation I was talking about earlier, where I was being asked about the program that I use for DEI, essentially where inclusion came up in yours, equitable came up in mine.
Mm-hmm.
And it had to do with a lot of, and it's that very binary piece that you were just talking a little bit about, where people are thinking equal and equitable. And how do we define those?
Yeah.
Because the way we define equal and equitable in the same way you're talking about inclusion is who's in and who's out group.
Yeah.
Equal and equitable define our terms of how we're now talking about the D and the I.
Well, the fact that, and I'm going to just be really strong here, the fact that women still don't make the same pay as men in Canada today, ludicrous. Ludicrous. Now, I also know, and hear me when I say this, no human will ever be paid their worth, period. Money is not the right metric to measure a person's worth. It's not the right metric to measure their contribution. It is simply one of the indicators of value, but it is not value or worthiness. So as much as the pay should be equal, and I agree, I also know that it's still just money, and money's a tool. Money is not the be-all and the end-all. However, universally, worldwide, women are still underpaid to men simply because of like plumbing. It doesn't make any sense. And I think this is the reckoning that we're at. And of course, that's an incredibly gendered conversation, which I just admitted to you all. I don't even subscribe to that gendered conversation anymore. I can have it because I identify as female, and I've spent 35 years of my career understanding what it means to be female in a male-dominated professional world, and the places that I have been that have been so dominated by males. But in reality, for those of us who know better, it shouldn't be about those things. We shouldn't be talking about that. So fascinating, really fascinating. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So when it comes to how we are looking at the topic at all, I keep coming back to, I'm going to put it this way. I'm going to call it the emotional intelligence piece.
Yeah.
That I feel like there's two conversations happening on the topic. One of which is, I love debate.
Yeah.
Right. And so if we're going to debate something, it's got a very clear rubric. What do we disagree with? Is it a point of fact, point of logic, incomplete analysis, off topic? I've got my rubric for debating, but then there's also an emotional intelligence. I just refuse to accept.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is one of those topics where I feel like when we're talking about it, it's so hard to have a really good data conversation and a really sensitive, emotional conversation, because they're just interfering with each other. And I don't even know how to. I love conflict coach. I love that. I love ripping it apart. But how do we make someone safe enough? Because there's lots of people who don't feel safe enough for the conversation.
Yes.
And I'd love your insight into how to make safe to have the data land.
So I can only speak from my own experience here. I'm certainly not an authority, but I am an authority on my own experience. I will say that. And that's the benefit of having had a professional coach in my life. Because I would argue none of us are the authority on ourselves until we have an opportunity to really critically view who we are and what we say. And that's what my coach has helped me do. So now I would say I am incredibly educated about me. And my journey was this. I had to relinquish my need, and I don't say need lightly, my need to be right. That's what I had to let go of in order to do any of this work personally and professionally. I had to have enough emotional intelligence, self-awareness, self-regulation, and for that matter, motivation to do it, to actually let my need to be right go. And in the short term, it felt dangerously vulnerable because my rightness and my belief about how right I was a real comfort to me. It made me feel secure. What I learned very shortly after I began to practice letting my being right go was that I discovered, first I discovered I wasn't right all the time, but I discovered that I could let my rightness go even in the short term. So for instance, in a conversation where conflict is happening, where we are not aligned, I could be the party to relegate my ego and allow not to admit I was wrong, but just to go, okay, let's talk about your perspective because I really want to understand it. And I'm open to hearing it. And I also am not going to defend myself while you share your perspective. And that really changed everything. All of a sudden, I began to recognize I had more power than I thought. And my need to be right in every conversation was actually me giving my power away. So that's been my experience. And I will say, I had to have some real good coaching to help me see myself in those moments so that I would actually understand the power that I was giving away. And for me, that was the part that allowed me to kind of begin to grow and change and also be willing to accept that I could be wrong or that I didn't have all the data in front of me. Because there's a lot more data about these things than we've ever had before because we've analyzed it. So, what I will say also, just not to speak into others' situations, because I would never want to do that, because I can only speak of me, but I will tell you because of my experience, when I am now in a conversation where I see someone else behaving the way I used to, I have great empathy because I recognize I understand why they're so defensive because they believe so deeply they are right. And I don't look down on them. I actually look at them and go, oh, I get it. I totally get it. And I also recognize they don't hear it in themselves. You and I have had this kind of a conversation where I have seen and heard you engage in a I know what I'm talking about stance. And I have played a more calm or cooler kind of balance to the conversation, whereby which then in the future, you and I have come back to that same topic and you've been like, yeah, I actually think differently. I've rethought that. I wasn't right. And, I had empathy for your position because it was just something that I could recognize I used to do. And I think that's how we're going to do this. That's how it's going to get done. I believe EQ is the lens to do it, not academia, not ramming data down people's throats to force their behavior. That will not do it. That will create polarizing conversations. What will create openness and softness towards this is empowering individuals to have their own journey of self-awareness and emotional intelligence.
So, a final question I want to ask you, because you brought it back to understanding, and I love that because that is what changes, right? When
Yes,
we change our understanding, it changes everything else.
absolutely.
So, both of us have children who identify as
Mhm.
part of the 2S LGBTQIA plus community.
Yep.
We have family. As a final question, what changed for you in your understanding that you might share for someone who doesn't yet understand?
Mm. This is gonna sound not professional because we don't talk about this a lot in a professional setting, but I would just say that love is what did it for me. And as a parent, I never struggled to love my children. I struggled to like them, and I struggled to like their choices and their behaviors, just as they did towards me, let's be clear. But the love wasn't a struggle. And when this all started to come up and rear its head in our family dynamic and they're needing to share with both my partner and I, their father, how they were feeling, how they identified, the initial belief, of course, was that both my partner and I would be disappointed in their choices. And very quickly, we were able to catch ourselves and go, whoa, 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 wait a minute. These are incredible, beautiful, amazing humans. It is a privilege and an honor to have them even as a part of our lives, let alone that we had any hand in creating their life. And the love just turned all the rest of it moot. And I have to say, I know we don't think about love in a work environment a lot of times, but I think we need to, not in the deep love and affection you have for family members or for partners, but in this idea of honoring and respecting someone's humanity. And when we, unconditional positive regard is how it's termed in sort of the psychology world. When you extend unconditional positive regard, you walk into every conversation with another human, assuming their positive intent. Now, do they have positive intent? You don't know yet, but just assume they do. And because of that pre-assumed disposition, see how that changes the conversation. Because it's like you're not setting someone up to fail in your eyes because you've already kind of decided they're going to. I don't like them because they don't believe what I believe. Okay, I get it. You don't like their beliefs, but does that mean you don't like them? Is it the same or can we separate them? For me, that was the key. I began to separate them and then I realized, I can extend unconditional positive regard to people that I'm just meeting in a professional context and not immediately decide that they're going to disappoint me or that I'm not going to get along with them. Now, it doesn't mean that I always enjoy their company or get along with them or like them. But what it has helped me do is see them through a different lens. And I do believe that lens ultimately is love, but it's more like honoring and respecting their humanity, not loving them the way we use the word love. And I think, in other languages, love is not just one word. English is a little bit limited. We have one word for love, but we apply it to like everything. I love apples. I love my partner. I love my kid. Well, no, I don't love them all at the same level. So I think the English language also limits us. Um, and other languages, like I said, they have other good describing words that can help. So I would just propose, I think it's love, but how we would translate that into a professional setting, I think it is this unconditional positive regard or this earnest belief that people at their core want health and goodness and don't have evil intent. And for those that do, we discover that and then we treat them accordingly once we've seen evidence. We don't decide going in that they're evil. And it's a tricky thing to do. But
Well, I completely agree because it's funny, as you were talking about different words, I was going back to the Greek philios,
right.
which is brotherly love,
Right.
which in and of itself is gender.
I was going to say it's very gendered.
Oh, great. Even the ancient historical word we used to use had a
gendered,
a gendered space in it.
Yeah.
And so I just want to thank you for today's conversation. And I'll pretty much guarantee you this will not be the last time we talk about DEI on this podcast.
Or IED or ID.
Acceptance, acknowledgement, understanding. There's a whole bunch of pieces still to explore. So thank you for today, and we'll see you again next time.
Okay.